Hello, Bob. Welcome back. Now we are coming to the end of our series, and this would be the last episode before next week, before the celebration
Right.
that is coming up soon. 4th of July, celebration of the Declaration of Independence, and uh, and I thought it would be fitting because I've been interviewing you from Tangier all this time in Morocco. I was thinking like we can have a conversation about how the Declaration of Independence inspired a lot of other declarations around the world, and then including the Moroccan Proclamation of Independence of 1944, which is has the same
Hmm.
symbolic stature in Morocco as the Declaration of Independence does in the United States, and we can see if there are any connections and differences between the
Hmm.
two, and this way we would pay a little tribute, celebrate a little bit Morocco's independence as well, in light of the great and historic and the landmark revolutionary event of the Declaration of Independence in the United States. So
Right.
I was just looking, I was reminded as I was trying to think of things to start the conversation with. I thought immediately of David Armitage's book, The Declaration of Independence: A Global History, and he says more than half the world's countries today, inspired by Jefferson's document, have their own Declaration of Independence. Uh, so that is an incredible impact on world
Hmm.
history since the Declaration of Independence was issued in 1776.
No, yes, it has. And, it begin with the French Declaration of the Rights of Man is really modeled on, it draws from this. And in fact, Lafayette and Thomas Paine, two people who are very much involved with the American Revolution, are involved in writing the Declaration of the Rights of Man. And then, of course, Haiti has its independence movement beginning in the 1790s, really an offshoot of the French Revolution as well as the American Revolution. Then in the 1820s, the South American republics, which are pushing for independence from Spain, use the Declaration as a model. And similarly, there's an independence movement going on in Greece against the Ottoman Empire. And in fact, at the 50th anniversary of American independence, when Thomas Jefferson and John Adams are two of the three remaining signers of the Declaration who are still living, are invited to come to Washington, and Jefferson declines, but he writes a letter to Roger Whiteman, who is organizing things, apologizing, but he says that all, all eyes are opening to the rights of man. And the realization will come to all eventually that half of mankind are not born with saddles on their backs, and a favored few, booted and spurred, ready to ride them at pleasure. And this is a cause for hope. And he talks about how this day July 4th, should ever be a day of remembering these principles of the revolution of 1776, this idea of fundamental human rights being the purpose of government, being to preserve rights, that we have the rights first, and then the government is something we create in order to protect rights. So that is really the revolutionary thing about the Declaration. And we see other examples. 1944 or 45, Ho Chi Minh in Vietnam writes a Declaration of Independence, and he really is using the Declaration, American Declaration, as a model for Vietnamese independence from the French. At the same time as, of course, Morocco is pushing for independence from the French.
Yeah, yeah, and so it had this huge, and even the United Declaration of Human Rights, and all these
Yes.
declarations that are have this international, not just necessarily national declarations, but global declarations of this and that.
Yes, they do. Yeah. And you wouldn't see this without, the Americans declare this. It's one of the first, and there have been there's an English Bill of Rights, other kind of antecedents, but this is these 13 colonies declaring their independence together and listing the reasons. And it begins with saying, when in the course of human events, it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another. So seeing this as the course of history, that this happens, that these political bands have been established, and now it's time to dissolve them. And a decent respect for the opinions of mankind requires they should declare the causes which impel them to this separation. So it's not just that we are breaking away from the king. It's not just a civil war, but we're proclaiming to the rest of the world, because we're going to take this separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and of nature's God entitle us. That is, all people are entitled to this.
Yes. And let's go back to the Declaration of Independence. Now, as we will be discussing the Moroccan Proclamation of Independence of 1944, and I'm sure immediately the thing that will strike most Americans, if not all Americans, and maybe everybody else, is that here, the Declaration, Morocco's Proclamation of Independence, includes the king. And
Yes.
whereas the American Declaration of Independence excludes the king, and in fact, it's written and it's stated against, opposition to the king, and
Right.
because the king has committed a whole list of usurpations,
Right. Yes.
and violated the freedoms of the colonists. So, in a way, we could think of the American Declaration of Independence as a list of grievances against the King of England
Yes.
or Britain.
Yeah. And this is kind of a curious thing, because the history of the American Revolution really is a history of resistance against Parliament trying to govern the Americans. And the Americans were content to be in the British Empire with the king as the head of state, similar to what becomes the British Commonwealth, where the monarch is the head of state, but Canada, Australia, other the West Indian places, Bahamas, all have the king or queen as their head of state, but then their own legislature. And the Americans had this idea that their legislatures govern them. And it was really Parliament that was overstepping, and Parliament that was exceeding its power. So in this list of grievances against the king, there are 27 of them, and about 7 or 8 says, and he has conspired with others to pass legislation. So that is the king and Parliament doing these things. And it's just really a shift, because Americans up until early 1776 had said, yeah, the king should be our ally in this against Parliament. And the king isn't. The king declares the Americans out of his protection. And that is going to lead to the Declaration of Independence. Why we can't remain part of the empire? Because of the king. And so in the case of Morocco, of course, it is different, because here the Moroccan people and the king are trying to get the French to stop governing them.
That's exactly right. So it is so the nature of the independence movement during in 18th century America was very different from the one in 20th century Morocco against the French, against a foreign colonizer. But the American colonists, considered themselves to be essentially part of Britain, England, until they were
not.
Unless they experienced those usurpations that Jefferson talks about.
Yeah, and the Declaration even talks about our British brethren, that we've tried to appeal to them, to our ties of consanguinity, that is common blood, even though not all, but maybe about 60% were of English descent. So it's not an overwhelmingly English population, but does have this tie, since they had been established by English colonists back in the 1600s. And they say how the draft of the Declaration, Congress takes this wonderful line out that we could have been a great and prosperous people together, but the English people have been deaf to our calls and have allowed their parliament to pass their legislative body, to pass pretended legislation over us. The Americans have this idea that their own legislatures govern them. Parliament governs people in England. And of course, Parliament's idea is, no, we govern the whole empire. And that was really the problem for the Americans, was Parliament overstepping. And just to be fair to King George III, he was defending Parliament's power to govern, not his own divine right. But he is really caught in this, because he sees Parliament as the great liberty guaranteeing body in the world, as British monarchs had since the late 1600s, when they agreed to this Act of Settlement, the English Bill of Rights, that we will, govern with Parliament, and Parliament is the body that guarantees liberty. Civil war in England in the 17th century, and King George is defending Parliament's rights against these Americans who he says are usurping the power of Parliament. The Americans say, no, Parliament is usurping our power to govern ourselves. And the Parliament's not going to back down, and the king is going to back. Parliament declares the Americans out of his protection, and then is going to wage war to ensure that Parliament is able to govern.
Yeah. And, in light of all of this, so it doesn't seem to be like, so had the king, the question would have been, had the king responded to all the demands of the colonies for their rights and hadn't practiced those, oppressive measures and so on, do you think there would still have been a revolutionary movement?
Well, there might not have been a revolutionary movement in America, but there probably would have been in Ireland, parts of England. Because remember, in England, not everyone is represented in Parliament. The Americans' idea is we need representation. So you can think about the king giving in to the American. This is exactly what he sees as the problem. If he gives in to the Americans, who else in the realm or in the empire is going to want self-government? And then what is he left with? It becomes really an issue later. In fact, during the war, a movement starts in England too, because the Americans are saying, we want representation. And then places like Liverpool, Birmingham, Manchester are saying, well, we want representation too. And what's going to happen? And so one member of parliament says, looking at this movement growing in England, saying your war in America is going to bring down your rotten system here, which in the 19th century it does. So the king has become he's trying to protect the empire. In the early 19th century, or 20th century, when the British Empire is contesting with Spain, protesting the way Spain is governing its empire, and says you need to give the people in Cuba self-government. This would have been in the 1890s. The Spanish government says we're sure the people of India and Ireland will be happy to hear this, that Britain's position is the people in colonies deserve self-government. And if the king had said that in 1776, it pretty much would have ended the empire. And the Americans would have seen, okay, we can push and then we get what we want. Franklin, by the way, Benjamin Franklin in the 1750s had kind of articulated something like this, having an American assembly that would govern the Americans. And what goes wrong with that isn't, Franklin says in his memoir, that the British would never have agreed to this, but the fact that the American colonies weren't ready to cooperate with each other in anything like that. They saw, boy, if Virginia gets something, then New York is cut out and vice versa. So the Americans in the 1750s weren't able to work together for this. They are in the 1770s, and it really is a surprise to the British that, the Americans then are able to win. But in the Declaration of Independence, they really are articulating something that isn't just us, that is us English people who have come here, but they really are making this a standard for all people. Whenever it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve these political bands, connecting them with another, that's not just us, but it's any people has this right to do this.
Yes. So that's why I was kind of pleased, sort of pleased. So when George Washington, his exchanges with the Sultan of Morocco, calling him, your Imperial Majesty, and
Yeah.
and thanking him for the support he gave the United States in its infancy by
Hmm.
by allowing American U.S. vessels to enter Moroccan ports and so on and so forth. And it was the Moroccan actually king who was pushing for this friendship
Yes, yes, yeah,
between these alliance, despite the fact the United States was near, but had just broken up with the superpower of the time,
yeah.
England, and then so. it shows the progressive nature of the Moroccan Sultan,
It does.
willing to ally himself or to include the United States in that relations. And so I think it's a beautiful letter from George Washington to the Sultan,
Yes.
which, by the way, when he arrived to Morocco, the Sultan had already died, so he didn't
Yeah.
get to see it.
Oh well, but his successor would have, and that has, and in
Yes.
the when Thomas Jefferson is the minister in France, and he because the United States then is at war, beginning of a war with Algiers and Tripoli, and they've gotten this entreaty from Morocco saying they want a treaty of alliance, and Jefferson goes to the French foreign minister Vergennes and says, the Sultan of Morocco says he would like to be an ally. And Vergennes says, no, no, no. He said, the Sultan of Morocco is the most self-interested man in the world. No, don't listen to him. It's interesting to hear the French foreign minister saying that, the leader of another country is self-interested. Not that France, of course, only has the interest of the world, all good people in the world at heart. And so they don't immediately follow up on the Sultan's entreaty to make an alliance with Morocco, but then Washington, as president, does. It's one of the first things, as in his presidency, reaching out to the Sultan, to affirm something that the previous Sultan had tried to launch in 1777, 14 years earlier, and then in 1785,
Okay. It's the same Sultan, yes.
Yeah. So it's. So that Sultan very great forethought in thinking, okay, we can make an alliance with the Americans. And in fact, there was a relationship that developed between the Americans and the Sultan, shipping mules from America to Morocco. Another trade entered into between, and there had been a long-standing trade between North America and Morocco into the late, in the 1600s, and then in the 1700s.
What's also interesting to me is that this relationship, this affection, if you will, this affection between the United States and Morocco continues to this day. And before we get to the Moroccan Proclamation of Independence, it was during the Second World War, when Franklin Roosevelt comes to Morocco and meets with leaders like Churchill and others, and he kind of met with the king of Morocco twice, and declared his support for Morocco's independence, and kept pressuring France over time to grant Morocco its independence. So there is this kind of, he had just come back from having drafted or declared the United States and the UK the what's called the Atlantic Charter.
Yes.
Yes, and which is about self-determination and other wonderful ideals, which can only be associated with, I'm assuming, with the United States. I'm assuming that Franklin Roosevelt was leading that conversation, not Churchill, because Churchill was still a colonial power in many parts of the world or something.
Yeah, you think about that, and Churchill recognizes we need the United States. And in fact, as the British are really facing the Battle of Britain, he says that if necessary, he would go to the New World if England is actually invaded. And there are plans to get the King of England to the New World. Churchill says he'll stay here, but he says, if necessary, we'll go to the New World, and in God's good time, the New World will redeem the old. So he knows he needs Roosevelt. And Churchill later will say he did not become prime minister of the British Empire to oversee the dissolution of the empire. He doesn't want to give self-determination to India or other places. But Roosevelt is really pushing this. And you think about why he is making this the foremost thing, saying that Britain has to agree to give up its colonies and France will have to give up her colonies. And self-determination had been kind of a goal for Wilson in his 14 points, but the 14 points really fail utterly, and the whole end of World War I leaves these colonial powers very much as firmly entrenched as they had been before. And they, in fact, they get Germany's old colonies. But now Roosevelt is pushing this at the very beginning of this with the Atlantic Charter, which he and Churchill sign on a warship off of Newfoundland in 1941, before the United States enters the war, understanding that we probably are going to enter the war. And then their first conference outside of the United States happens, as you said, in Casablanca, when Roosevelt goes to Morocco, and seeing this is going to be a goal of the United States. And the United States also will give up the Philippines, grant self-government to the Philippines after the war. And so this is really a major shift, since the colonial enterprise is something that really had made Europe bloom between the 1400s and the early 19th century. And now it is the United States pushing for an end to this that is really a central part of the Second World War, defeating the Nazis, and as well as the Japanese, who have taken over much of Southeastern and East Asia, is really central to Roosevelt's goals for the post-war settlement.
Bob, this is like a parenthetical question or discussion. I mean, as I'm thinking now about history, Britain, France, Spain, these great European colonial powers, it makes you wonder why the United States, with all its might, never became a real empire. It became very influential in world politics and economics, but never really established an empire outside of its frontiers, natural frontiers, so to speak.
Yeah, and it's
Except
natural
now
frontiers.
you mentioned the case of the Philippines.
Yeah. The Philippines,
Yes.
at different times, the United States governed Cuba, still does govern Puerto Rico, Guam, other places. But you're right. I mean, it does get control of the North American continent. And of course, there are some scholars, leftists, who will say that the United States is an imperial power. And much of this anti-colonial rhetoric we hear now isn't so much directed against colonial powers as against what's regarded as the hegemonic state. Thank you. It's the United States. So, but yeah, and it was an issue back in the 1840s when the United States does go to war with Mexico. And John Quincy Adams writes that the acquisition of Texas is the beginning of the end of a republic and the beginning of an empire. And one really thinks about that. I suspect it is because the United States gets control of North America that it doesn't have to, like these other European powers, get to other places. But in fact, it could have, you think about this, because it could have followed the model of the European states. And in fact, it's in 1824 when President James Monroe, the Monroe Doctrine, we know as what says the United States won't tolerate any European powers colonizing in the New World. And it doesn't mean that the United States is going to colonize in the New World, but it does mean that we won't allow this. But again, the United States in 1824 did not have the power to enforce this. The British didn't want the Spanish or the Portuguese or the French or the Dutch to expand their holdings in the New World, which they were trying to do. That is, the French, the Dutch, mainly the French, the Dutch, even the Germans see Spain weakening, and this our opportunity to grab Venezuela or other places. And in fact, Brazil is governed in the 1820s. Brazil is actually governing the Portuguese Empire, which had moved to Brazil in the wake of Napoleon's invasion. This, again, is a long discursive statement about what's happening. Britain wants to keep the others out, so it, in the United States, reached this agreement that the United States and Britain won't allow this. It's President Monroe the British wanted this as a joint declaration. John Quincy Adams, who is Secretary of State, tells President Monroe, we will just announce this. But the second part of the Monroe Doctrine is the United States won't interfere in the internal affairs of Europe. There was pressure in the United States to support the Greeks in their war against the Ottoman Empire. And the United States says, we're not going to get involved in European affairs, but we also won't allow Europe to get involved in the affairs of the Americas. So it's partly an idealistic thing, with the right of all people to govern themselves, but it's partly also a way of keeping European powers from, having the same kind of contests in the Americas that they were having in Europe as well as in Asia and Africa over who controls what. So the real scramble for colonies is going to happen in Africa, on the African continent, and in Asia, the contest over India, and then over Southeast Asia and East Asia.
Yeah, I kind of romantically have always assumed that it's morally difficult for Americans to engage in imperial adventures, knowing that they are the authors of the Declaration of
I
Independence
think you're. I
and
think
what
you're
it
absolutely
says.
right.
So
You're
it's
absolutely
kind of
right because your hypocrisy will be pointed out both by people you are trying to help, as well as by these imperial powers who really want to get control of these places. Boy, what a bunch of hypocrites the Americans are. Yeah, the Soviet Union certainly was playing this up during its time when it was controlling Eastern Europe as well as satellites in Central America and other places. So yeah, it is difficult though for the Americans to justify this, and because of the Declaration of Independence, and that's something you wonder why the authors of it, who were very realpolitik people, would put this in. Make this is our reason for doing this. Isn't so we can expand, but so that we all people can have these rights. And to Franklin Roosevelt's credit, he is pushing this at the very beginning of what is it's a global war, and this has to be one of the primary outcomes of the war is self-determination for people. Wilson had made it self-determination of basically ethnicities. And with Roosevelt, it's really something a bit different. I mean, it's up to the Moroccan people and their wonderful proclamation. Make this clear, but it's the Moroccan people who are pushing this, and we're not saying we're going to be the Islamists or the Berbers. It is the one Moroccan people and a Moroccan nation which has existed long before these European powers actually became European powers.
Yeah, yes. Yeah, I think the Declaration of Independence launched a great movement of freedom that has persisted to this day, and it inspired it. Even when you look at the language of other 20th century documents like the Declaration of Human Rights or the Atlantic Charter, or all of this self-determination, all of them derive directly or indirectly from the ethos or from the principles or from the worldview that is encoded in the Declaration of Independence.
Yes, absolutely. It really launches this idea, and it is. You think if the Americans had not won their war for independence, what if someone might pick this out, the Declaration, out of some dusty archive, and say, "Well, this is actually a fascinating idea." You can think of this inspiring people the way, say, the writings of Marx or others have inspired others, picking something out of what someone called the dustbin of history. Even though we don't need to talk about Marxism at this particular moment, since we're talking about the independence, but yeah, you think bad ideas do have a way of coming back somehow, and the Declaration of Independence really is a good idea that we do. There's a wonderful poem by Archibald MacLeish about Thomas Jefferson, that you, Thomas Jefferson, you could not lie so still. You could not bear the weight of stone on your quiet hill. You could not keep your green grown peace, nor hold your folded hand if you could see your new world now, your sweet new land. There was a time, Thomas Jefferson, when free words made free men. The new-found world and the new freed mind were brothers then. There was a time when tyrants feared the new world of the free. Now freedom is afraid and shrieks at tyranny. Freedom was a thing to use. They've made a thing to save and staked it in and fenced it round like a dead man's grave. But you, Thomas Jefferson, you could not lie so still. You could not bear your weight of stone on your quiet hill. You could not hold your angry tongue if you could see how bold the old, stale, bitter world plays new, and the new world old. So this idea of human freedom is really central to the Declaration of Independence, which makes it even more astonishing that at the very beginning, uncertain about how this was going to turn out, they staked their lives, their fortunes, and their sacred honor on these principles.
Well, this is a great segue into, if you don't mind me asking you to, if you would, read Morocco's Proclamation of Independence as a gift to us in Morocco, and that would be a great thing to do if you have, if you're willing to do so. If not, we can continue this conversation.
No, of course, it's a wonderful document. I'm glad you have shared it with me. The Proclamation of Independence of Morocco, January 11, 1944. Praise God for the Istiqlal Party, which is composed of members of the former Nationalist Party, as well as independent persons, whereas Morocco has always constituted a free and sovereign state, and that it has held its independence through 13 centuries, up until the moment when, under particular circumstances, a protectorate regime was imposed upon it. Whereas the regime's objective and purpose were to give Morocco a set of administrative, financial, and military reforms without impinging on the traditional sovereignty of the Moroccan people under the aegis of their king. Whereas under this regime, the authorities of the protectorate have replaced that system with a system of direct and despotic rule for the benefit of the French colony, including the military and employees, in which Morocco only plays a minimal role, and in which the French authorities have not attempted to address the various needs of the different elements of the country. Whereas the French colony, through this system, has been able to take over all channels of power, as well as to appropriate and monopolize the country's resources to the detriment of its citizens. Whereas the regime has attempted, through all possible means, to break the unity of the Moroccan people, to prevent Moroccans from effectively participating in the governance of their country, and to deprive them of every individual civil liberty. Whereas the circumstances the world faces today are not those in which the protectorate was established. Whereas Morocco has participated significantly in the world wars next to the Allied forces, with Moroccans having impressed everyone with their accomplishments in France, as well as Tunisia, Sicily, Corsica, and Italy, and with the expectation that they will participate in other theaters as well, particularly in the liberation of France. Whereas the Allies, who shed their blood for the cause of liberty, stated in the Atlantic Charter that all peoples have the right to self-determination, to govern themselves by themselves, and expressed recently at the Tehran Conference their resentment toward the doctrine that the mighty should dominate the weak. Whereas the Allies expressed their support for Muslim peoples on multiple occasions and have granted independence to some of those whose past and present civilizations are less developed than Morocco's. Whereas the Moroccan nation, which is a harmonious union of its different elements, feels that what is rightfully its own in terms of rights, and what is upon it in terms of responsibilities within the country and beyond its borders, under the patronage of its beloved king, and profoundly appreciates its democratic liberties, which are intrinsically consonant with our true religion, which has been the foundation of governance in fellow Islamic countries, decides the following. First, to demand the independence of Morocco and the unity of its territory under His Majesty King Mohammed bin Yusuf, may God aid and help him. Second, to implore His Majesty to seek the recognition and affirmation of this independence from nations concerned, and to sign treaties that define, within the context of Moroccan sovereignty, the legitimate roles of foreigners in Morocco. Third, to request the addition of Morocco to the group of states that have ratified the Atlantic Charter and that participated in the peace conference. Fourth, to implore His Majesty to support the reform movement that Morocco fundamentally depends on, and to bring apt attention the creation of a consultative political system similar to the governments in Arab Islamic countries in the East, in which the rights of all elements of Moroccan society and its social classes are ensured, and in which the responsibilities of all are defined. Wa Salam, signed by 66 Moroccans, including one woman.
Wow. Coming from you, it's almost like Thomas Jefferson was reading Morocco's Proclamation of Independence.
Well, it's really a wonderful document.
That is not included, signed by 66 Moroccans, including one woman. I just was curious to see that there was one woman in the group. I know that the Declaration of Independence was signed by 56 delegates.
56, all men, yes, and they were all representative of 13 of the colony states. In 1777, Congress has the first edition of it printed with the delegate signatures. The first printing only has John Hancock, the president of Congress, and Charles Thompson. And in fact, the delegates don't actually sign it until August, because then they print the copies first, distribute the printed copies, then have a parchment copy made, which the delegates then sign. And in January of 1777, Congress wants a new one printed with all of the delegate signatures. And they turn this job over to a printer in Baltimore named Mary Catherine Goddard. And she prints it. And as is customary, a printer will put at the bottom who printed it. So Mary Catherine Goddard puts printed by Mary Catherine Goddard, Baltimore, Maryland. So that copy, that version has a woman's name at the bottom, the printer, but no signers, unlike the Moroccan proclamation.
Well, this is a perfect and fitting conclusion to this series. My goal was to do this series with you, mostly for me and also for the rest of the world, especially to keep this as an archive, a historical archive for people to see and watch in the decades to come. And I think this is a great lesson. We are still in Morocco. There's not enough attention given to American history. I don't know about the rest of the world, but I think that's my feeling, that people pay far more attention to political events than they do real history, and absolutely,
yes,
yeah.
If it's any consolation, I don't think enough attention is paid to American history in the United States. So I really appreciate you opening up this dialogue so that we can talk about American history, with an audience in Morocco as well as in the United States and in other places.
Thank you. And even though the series is ending, I'm sure I'm going to do other interviews with you. On different aspects of American history and other aspects that fascinate you, and I wish you. I'm hopefully be able to talk to you soon. But if I don't, well, happy anniversary, happy 250th anniversary. I'll be in Morocco. You'll be in Boston,
yes.
And we are both set up. It's a global event, as we just mentioned today. Yes. The Declaration of Independence was designed for the American people, for the colonies, but also for the rest of the world.
That's right. That's what Jefferson said in that letter to Roger Whiteman, that all eyes are opening to the rights of man.
Yes.
So may they continue to be open.
Thank you, Bob.
Thank you, Anouar. Good to talk to you.